So this is like a continuation from last week, which we were looking into European papers. So some of the terminology, the scientific terminology, will be coming through on this lecture as well. But we're looking very specifically at the movement from China into Japan, where the Tsumi-washi, as it's called, the craft of handmade paper making thrived. Okay, so the contents of the lecture, and I do apologise, it is a bit long, but I'm just going to briefly go through the history, use and context. There will be a definition of terms, and then I'll look into the traditional processes of nagashi suki, which includes fibre description, the production process, the formation aid, which is added to the pulp, and then a little bit about how Japanese paper informs artistic practice, what it can offer contemporary artists, and distinguishing handmade from machine-made papers, and also recognising quality. And then a bit negative probably, but the sad case of the slight erosion of the craft, and the introduction of more contemporary methods and production. So if you look at the history and context, the introduction of paper making, as I mentioned last week, was by Sai Lung. It's commonly cited as Sai Lung, who was a eunuch in the imperial court in China under the Emperor Ho Ti, and that's about 105 AD. So he's very widely credited as being the inventor of paper, but fairly recently, in the last 20 or so years, there's been a number of archaeological digs which have uncovered several fragments of paper made from hemp and rami, which is from the Han dynasty, which is much, much earlier, i.e. the 2nd century BC. They're very crude and obviously predate Sai Lung's introduction, but it's been around for many, many years, thousands of years. And if you remember, thinking back during the last presentation, when we looked at European paper making, that really started during the Arab invasion of Europe, so this is much, much earlier. So whether Sai Lung was the inventor of paper or not, maybe we'll never know, but he did introduce a number of changes to the earlier method. He introduced bamboo flexible molds, and he introduced tree bark, which he probably got inspiration from Southeast Asia. They make a lot of tappa cloth from a raw material very similar to the bast fibres, which Sai Lung is reputed to have used. So the spread of Japanese, or the spread of paper making from China into Japan came by way of Buddhist monks. So about 610 AD, it reached the shores of Japan. And by the 4th and 6th centuries, then paper making in Japan was very, very much part of the culture. The introduction to the Japanese court was by Dam Jung, who is a Korean priest, and he's said to have spoken to the eunuchs at the imperial court in Kyoto and introduced the craft there. And by the 8th century, most definitely the craft was well established, and the quality of the paper far surpassed the Chinese. Now, the uses of Japanese paper, I'm sure you've all heard that many things are made from paper in Japan. It's a very enduring symbol of Japanese culture and very much a cherished commodity. And clothing, you'll see this quite early 19th century kimono which is made entirely from paper. It's a male kimono. Obviously fans, umbrellas, kites and lanterns, boxes, house petitions, and we use similar kind of construction in conservation for drying paper board. They're called carry-barry boards, but they're shoji screens when they're used in houses to petition areas off. And then we've got folding screens, scrolls, as well as obviously the important introduction of books, documents, prints and paintings. So an enduring and cherished commodity. In Japan, to formally acknowledge the role Japanese papermakers have in Japanese culture, there are a number of them, and I was very fortunate to meet a couple of them who are designated national living treasures. And this is a scheme that is supported by the government, and they also receive quite a number of financial gains in order to keep the craft alive. But I think it's rather lovely. Have you met any national treasures? They also have them in making of screens and other accoutrements that go with Japanese papermaking. So very highly regarded by the government. Now the uses in the West, despite Japan's previous isolation, especially during the Edo period, which was from about 1603 to 1867, they did restrict the amount of trade. Most trade was just within the country. But after that, during the Meiji period, it loosened up a little bit. But paper did get out via the Dutch, and even as early as the 17th century, and we can see here a print on Japanese paper by Rembrandt. He used quite a number of kozo papers for his work. So in the West we can trace back uses in European culture, particularly in printmaking, from the 17th century. More recently, Japanese paper have become a vital material in the field of conservation in particular, which is my field, for its strength, flexibility, excellent aging characteristics and translucency. So it's highly valued for paper conservators and archive conservators for supporting or repairing fragile artifacts. Also, there's a growing trend with contemporary artists or contemporary art practitioners who are increasingly using the flexibility, the unique presence and working characteristics of the paper. So that's growing, which is great. Now, the special characteristics of washi, I've already mentioned the strength and its longevity, and that cannot be underestimated because it does last considerably longer than wood-based European papers. The strength really comes from the raw materials, the purity of the process, and the absence of chemicals. I mean, we mentioned, or I mentioned last week, of the increasing use of bleaches and alum and rosin sizes. There's nothing of that description at all in Japanese paper. Also, they have a very high internal cohesion, the fibres, and great length of the fibres in comparison with, say, European machine-made wood papers. So strength and longevity come from those three: purity, absence of chemicals, and careful selection and preparation of materials as well. So if we look more towards the actual distinction between Japanese papermaking that's going on, I'm not touching on machine-made papermaking because I know almost nothing about it. I'm just hoping Mimi will infiltrate the commercial side and perhaps enlighten us when she hands in her dissertation. But There's two basic methods, one called the tamazuki and the negashisuki, which is the handmade one. So the tamazuki is very much a hybrid of Western paper making. I described that last week, how they dip in the screen or the mould and how they cast. It's very similar to that. They drain the water in a very similar way. And it's mainly used for very thick, almost board-like papers, but they're definitely European style. They have the fibres, as we discussed last week, have very little preferred orientation. So across the grain and with the grain, the fibres are arranged almost equally. So they don't have a distinct grain direction. Whereas the Nagashisuki began in about the 8th century, which is the Nara period, and this is the favoured method of traditional handmade craftsmen. And it's dependent on a mucilage, which I'll go into in a moment, which reduces the water drainage through the mould. They also use a different method of forming the sheet, which means that it's cast off, the excess is cast off in a very dynamic sloshing action, which I'll again show you in a moment. And you also get much greater variations in sheet thickness and qualities. We've seen just 3 or 4 going around the table. So you get much greater variation. And unlike the European method, they have a very pronounced grain direction. So that obviously determines how you tear it, how it expands and contracts with water, all those sort of things. It has a fundamental implication for when you're working with Japanese paper to understand the grain direction. So we'll look at some pictures now and the traditional process of Nagashisuki. Sorry, Mimi, I'm sure I'm making a real hash of the pronunciation. So who makes the paper? Well, traditionally it was a rural industry formed only in the winter months by farmers. So it was to supplement the lean months during the winter. It's also very good to make paper in the coldest conditions. That's why it's alarming when it's warm in here, because it can introduce an awful lot of bacteria very quickly. So cold obviously inhibits that or eliminates it. In traditional paper making as well, rather than using chemical bleaches, they use snow and sun bleaching. Now they have bitterly cold, snowy winters in many parts of Japan, with a lot of sun as well. So they lay out the raw fibres usually in not this stage, the other that stage, lay it out, and other stages as well. So it's a natural bleaching process, and that produces the strongest, finest, naturally white paper. But increasingly, as paper was being used, the farmers, went on to doing paper making pretty much all through the year. So they abandoned farming. And now we have they have enormous industrial plants which combine both traditional techniques. It's a hybrid. It's using a lot of the original fibres, the bast fibres, but they add all sorts of things to the pulp in order to increase production and produce things that are very much commercially viable. So they're copycats, and they're quite difficult to tell the difference, really. So we look at the fibres now. Traditionally, as I've said, Japanese paper is made from 3 distinct types of paper. Kozo, Mitsumata and Gampi, which is also known collectively as paper mulberry. That's the Kozo. And it's a low-growing deciduous tree, and it's cultivated very widely in Japan and South Asia generally. And it accounts for, so it's this style of paper accounts for probably 90% or more of Japanese paper making. There are 3 species known which are used as the raw material. Morus alba, the Bronsettia, so kind of names that you're probably familiar a little bit in your garden, you know, exotic shrubs and things are very similar, and the Papaferia as well, which is the most common and most highly regarded. So Kozo produces very strong, soft, fibrous and flexible papers. So they have very distinct, if you want to pass them around, you can see, you know, a number of the kind of long fibre, much more woollier than the Mitsumata and the Gampi. You pass it around again, just to get an idea. It makes excellent printing and painting supports. So you get a lot of Japanese scrolls painted on this type of material. Also a lot of ukiyo-e prints, the images of the floating world, which is a Utamara in the top right hand corner there, is mid-Edo period. That's characteristic of the kind of images of the floating world. And most of these prints are produced on Kozo paper. The highest quality are known as Hosho, which was the Imperial Court Kyoto Imperial Court paper. So you get the privately printed Japanese prints on this very fine Hosho paper. So Kozo comes in an astonishing range. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of different types of sheet. The thicknesses change, the tones and surface characteristics, but they all have a similarity in that they're quite woolly texture when you compare it with others. And this is, as I say, the finer version. And pass that. Kozo fibres, as I said, they're very strong and soft, and that's to do with their long fibre length. And on average, they're 10 millimetres in length, which is extraordinary for paper that's been processed. So this is what the shrub looks like, the Bronsettia, and that's what the fibre looks like in cross-section. We do in conservation an awful lot of fibre analysis, and this is what the sort of characteristics we look for: the nodes, the quite thick cell wall, and these are called parenchymal additional cells, which are part of the plant's growth cycle, and this rather flaccid kind of membrane either side, but very straight and long, very straight. So that's Kozo. So if we now look at Mitsumata, which is probably the second most common paper, this is cultivated or harvested from the wild in either mountainous areas of Japan. It's also found in China as well. It's part of the Daphne family, so it's a low-growing deciduous tree. And records, a bit sketchy, but they think it was used in paper making from about 1614. So fairly recent, really. There are 3 native species and 2 cultivated species, and the most common is the Edgeworthia Papaferia and the Gardineri. Now their fibre length is much shorter, so 5 millimetres in length. So these also produce very soft, absorbent, pliant, thinner papers probably than you would get with Kozo. And they have a slight luster to the surface, and much smoother in characteristics. So they're quite different in texture, and that's a Mitsumata. You get this lovely warm tone with a lot of the papers. I mean, you do get them in various tones, but that quite brownish tone is quite characteristic. Again, it's excellent for printing, painting, and used a lot in calligraphy as well. Chinese like it too, because it's quite similar to bamboo and their bast fibres, which are much smoother. I'll have to do a session on Chinese, I think. So this is the bush, Edgeworthia Gardineri, and again very straight fibres, no nodes on this one, cross striations going across the fibre, so we can tell that. And this rather large parenchyma looks like a big studded potato. They're minute, tiny, tiny, tiny little things. But we get very excited, paper researchers do, when we find this under the microscope. And then Gampi, the rarest of all. Now this cannot be cultivated commercially. It's harvested from the wild in high mountainous regions, very cold, high mountainous regions. So it can be incredibly expensive to buy. It's again a deciduous tree, part of the Daphne family. And quite low growing, very slow growing as well. It was introduced during the Heian period, which again is fairly recent, and there's 3 species which I won't even. I think the japonica is the most common out of the 3. This is much thinner fibre. And the parenchymal, and you can see quite a thin, woody little strapling of a tree, and that produces these amazing, lustrous, almost like they've been glazed and burnished by hand. And they have this distinct rattle, which is quite different from the other 2 species. Used a lot in Buddhist paintings, and often they were dyed with Budu, which is a yellow, very similar to a yellow earth. You get bright yellow Buddhist scripts on this very precious paper. This is only half a sheet, but you can pay up to £20 or £30 a sheet for this. I've got some hand-coloured or hand-dyed ones when I went to Japan the last time, which are £20 a sheet, and that was 3 or 4 years ago. So very precious. Obviously you do get papers that have mixtures, and Mitsumata now is often mixed with Kozo, and you do get Gampi mixed with Mitsumata sometimes. Depends on the type of quality they're looking for. So if we look finally at the characteristics of the Gampi papers, very fine, tough, pronounced rattle, as I've said, glossy, translucent and lustrous. But it's much shorter fibre. It's a nightmare to work with when you're adding water to it. There are a number of Japanese and Chinese calligraphers that use Gampi papers, and how they control the expansion and contraction rates is very admirable, because it is a very willful paper to deal with. It's a beautiful presence, but if you're introducing moisture, it can be difficult. There are a number of lesser known fibres as well, which we haven't got time to go into, but bamboo creeps in. You would think, you know, in Japan they'd have huge amounts of bamboo, mainly found in China, bamboo papers, and they're not great quality by any means. Rice straw, again it's fairly recent. Rice straw was added. You cannot make paper just with rice straw, you need to add it to other things. Wheat straw occasionally is found as well, some other grass fibre. Again, you would add it to stronger bast fibres. And Carrara, which I know very little about, but is part of the lupinus family. But you do sometimes see, mention of this. It's a bark fibre. So you will find these mixtures, and sometimes exclusively bamboo, but always avoid bamboo papers, because again they're very difficult to work with. Okay, we'll look at the production now. So harvesting and stripping the bark is, I don't know why they're coming down one by one now, but with kozo and mitsumata, you can cut it during the winter period, the shrub. You bundle it up and store it until it's required. But unfortunately, and they remove the bark as well. But the gampi, you have to strip it in the field or up on the mountainside, and use it fairly quickly because it perishes. So again, that increases the human interaction and the difficulty of the process by having to strip it, in freezing cold up the mountainside. And this is a man harvesting kozo. They trim them down. It's almost like a severe poultry. They cut them down right at the base, and then they spring up in the spring, and probably 2 or 3 years later they're ready to harvest again. But they use these traditional tools. You can see here, these would be all handmade, very specific to the paper maker. And this is what kozo bark, wonderful looking things. I've seen huge kind of storerooms and barns where they have hundreds of these bundles stored one on top of the other. Beautifully done, beautifully done. Need to be kept dry though, obviously, because you can get mould forming and green coloration along the bark. This looks very primitive, but actually, although these photographs are some years old, from the 60s, I have seen stripping the bundles using this type of steaming process. So over a natural fire at the bottom here, and this comes down to contain the steam. So they steam the bundles first before that softens everything up, and then they strip it. Usually women do this job, and they strip it by hand. Remember, in the freezing cold, sitting on your knees all those hours, it's a very difficult job. Now, after stripping, they boil the white bark for several hours in open vessels, and then they add lye or wood ash or some other caustic alkali. And again, that's derived from a particular Japanese tree which is used, the wood ash. It's very alkali, probably around about pH 13, which is very caustic. Now, the function of the alkali, similar way to processing European paper that we spoke on last week. It removes lignin, pectins, waxes and gums. So it strips a lot of the detritus and the additional things added to the fibre. So you're just left with the pure cellulose fibre itself. But unlike European paper making, where we tend to remove the immature bark, which is known as hemicelluloses, it's certainly stripped away almost completely in commercial wood processes. It's kept largely intact, and they think that has, although they still don't really understand the function of hemicelluloses, they think that has an awful lot to do with the intrinsic strength of the fibres. So that's kept pretty much intact. It does bring down the pH of the paper though, naturally. So after that, they need to wash, remove all the caustic alkali. So they wash very thoroughly the white inner bark in cold running water. It's fortunate that in Japan they have such high quality streams of soft, pure water which make excellent handmade paper and helps the long-term and aging characteristics of the paper. And this is a typical stream where the white bark is laid out, freezing cold work, and that naturally obviously runs across, removing all the caustic alkali. And then this is the kind of method that they traditionally used to dry the white bark. All very simple. Removing the impurities, so although they've used the caustic soda really to remove a lot of the detritus, you might get little tiny black pieces of bark which are known as chiri. Sometimes Japanese paper has this purposely left in. It's more for decorative papers because it gives a kind of quite textured look to it. It's quite pretty. But certainly if you want something to last a long time, and certainly for conservation, we would never use paper with chiri or the black bark still intact, because it can go in damp conditions, it can leach out tannins and stain the paper. Again, it's a very painstaking but vital job done by hand, again traditionally by women, and these are the kind of setups. I mean, they do vary from mill to mill, but setup that you can see the picking, and they'll take a bundle, you can see here, and spend a good half an hour picking through it by hand to make sure all those tiny fibres are removed. Now, bleaching, I've mentioned already, they don't use chemical bleaches. Traditionally they use the sun and snow, so and that's followed by more washing because it oxidizes the paper even so, and it's quite a interventive process in regards to the longevity of the fibre, but they do follow it with more washing. And then the beating process, which as I mentioned last week in regards to European paper making, very, very important. You can determine the quality of the paper significantly by how and how long you beat. So it serves, as I mentioned before last week, it serves to tease out this beating and collapse the fibres, which increases the surface area, thus promoting hydrogen bonding, and we spoke about that last week. The more hydrogen bonding, or the more chemical bonds which are formed between the fibres, the stronger, more flexible, the better the paper. So beating is crucial. If you beat it too much, you get very short, weak fibres. If you don't beat it enough, you get clumps, undispersed clumps of fibres. It affects the sheet absorbency and the thickness as well. Very important to beat it correctly. So how do they beat? They used to, and still do, beat by hand, and that's what you can do in the studio here. You can use the Hollander, or you can use a hardwood mallet on a stone slab. Also, I've seen in Japanese mills mechanical stampers, which are roughly based on a Hollander beater, and they were introduced to Japan in the late 19th century, so that's during the Meiji period. So this is beating the life out of the pulp with like a wooden mallet. You can use rounded mallets like that with a distinct pattern. or this is the primitive mechanical stamper, a nightmare for health and safety, wouldn't it, if we had that thing? People falling into it.
Have we got a leak?
No. Look at his hand.
Quite easy
Whilst
to
it's
build
still
that.
his hand. Yeah, his hand in there as it's
I quite fancy the wooden beating though. We've got some big mallets like that.
We've got something similar in paper construction. Yeah. But you could use, you know, for flesh beating, you know, for meat. You could use that.
Like steak hammers.
Yeah.
I've noticed
Tenderizer.
big beaters beaten.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes the best paper.
Yeah.
Definitely.
How long do you have to beat it for?
Um,
Days on end.
Several hours.
Right. We could take it in turns.
Yes. One day.
Perhaps we could get Ange to do
Yeah. Yes. Or students who have been naughty. Okay, so when the pulp or stocks completed, it's either immediately added to the water to make the stock of solution, or sometimes they dry it into balls which are rehydrated later, and generally they do a pulp ball about this sort of size, which makes about 15 sheets of paper. It's only an average, but depends on how thick and how many times you cast it, but it's a kind of a ball pulp. So we can rehydrate it later or straight into the vat.
Does it affect it if you've effectively dried it again? Does that affect the fact you've beaten it? Do you have to rebeat it? Or is it just
No, you don't. You just rehydrate it. So it's at... Can you get that back on? It's not in the frame, but it shows you the pulp. Anyway, this is a vat. Not that dissimilar really from a European vat, although they tend to be made with wood. So this is after cooking and beating. So it's not in a ball, but it's in fragments. But you just add water, and then disperse it with a mallet or your hand, and then that's ready for the making.
So is it possible to buy?
I think you can now. I think you
Yeah.
can get stuff online. In fact, I saw some the other.
Interesting.
You can get anything now online, can't you? Now the unusual thing about Japanese paper making, apart from the fibres really, well, I mean it's all interesting and quite different in many ways, but it's the formation aid, or the neri. Now the neri is a vegetable, quite viscous mucilage, and it's unique to Korean paper making and Japanese. And you know that it came from China through to Korea into Japan. So the Koreans make quite lovely paper actually. The introduction of the neri is quite vague, but they think it's around the 8th century. And it's sourced from two distinct roots really, tuarai, which is a member of the mallow family, or hibiscus maniote. So they're herbaceous plants, so you use the roots and harvest it usually during the early winter period. Or less common, Hydrangea paniculata, which is a deciduous tree, and they use the inner bark. But most often it's the tuarai root that's used. Now the function of the neri, it slows down the drainage of the pulp through the mould, so it's not as rapid as European paper making. It acts as a dispersant, so it prevents clumping and flocking of the fibres in the sheet. It helps to align the fibres as well in one direction, almost lubricates them with, or coats them individually. And it stops the individual sheets, when they couch them one on top of the other, it stops them from sticking together, or what we call blocking. And it also adds to the luster and the finish quality of the paper. But it's not a size. It's not a sizing agent in any shape or form like we would use in European papermaking. Although it may add some additional strength to the fibres. So they beat the hell out of this as well. It's quite a difficult thing to beat. It's very woody, and they have to soak it, usually overnight, and then drain it through muslin, and then you get this thick, sort of gloopy, slightly yellow colour mucilage. We'll come to how it's added to the paper in a minute. So if we look now at the screen, now the moulds or the screens are composed of two distinct parts, very similar in a way to European papermaking. They have two parts, but they're made very differently from different materials. So you get the whole screen is called the sugetta, and then it's composed of the kita, which is the rigid screen, traditionally made from Japanese cypress, and then you have the su, which is made from bamboo, which is held against the kita to stop the pulp sliding off. And the 5 ribs are made up of bamboo, not wire, like in European, and they're weaved together using silk threads, and they impregnate them with persimmon juice, which we use for waterproofing our Caribari drying boards as well. But it also helps waterproof. It's almost like a thin plastic coating, really, when it's used correctly. So this is what the moulds look like, very different from European. You can see the distinct chain lines that you will find. And with Japanese paper, you get this like double. That's a sign of good quality handmade paper as well. Get this double and then single, single, double, single, single, double. But this is completely and utterly hinged. It's not completely detached like in Western paper making. It's bamboo, which it's like the mats you get for making sushi. Very similar. And they dovetail. Amazing how they make them. It's fine work. You know, it looks as though it's been produced on a machine. It's so fine. And that's the flexible bamboo screen, which is lifted off and then you couch the fibres. Now this is unusual. This is a Korean paper, and they have the main chain lines going from left to right, whereas in Japanese, from top to bottom. You can tell Korean paper making by the style of flexible bamboo screen. But this is a Japanese, and this is how you hold it. They also have little rings here which you can attach to a pulley. Some of the screens are very large indeed. If you look now at forming the sheet, in the vat they put the water in there, the pulp, that's evenly dispersed, and also the soap neri. Some special papers, particularly those who are used for scroll mounting, the last lining of the scroll, and sometimes there's up to 4 or 5 layers in a Japanese scroll. They will add things like calcium carbonate. It's called gofun, which is from ground oyster shells that have been aged for 10, 15 years. Sometimes they have uncooked grain or starch granules added. Quite rare, but we do get them occasionally. And that also helps things like burnishing the back, because scrolls are usually burnished, the last layer, to protect it from fingerprints. dust falls off it better, and it looks nicer, more flexible. So this is the Papermaker adding the neri, so it squeezes it through the muslin into the wooden bat. Pretty much everything is wooden in traditional handmade paper. And then they begin the sheet formation. So the Papermaker scoops the pulp into his mould, and then the excess pulp is rapidly cast off from the screen. So it's very different from that ripple effect. Remember last week, that slow ripple effect, and just really lifting a European screen up like that. Whereas with Japanese paper, they cast it off. I'll show you in a minute. And this process can be repeated several times. If you want a thicker sheet, you cast one layer, then another, and then another, until the desired thickness is achieved. But this is the man beginning, dips the mould in. It's done very, very quickly, charging the pulp.
Does it not disturb the first layer when the second layer is cast then?
Sorry,
Does it not disturb the first layer?
Not with experience.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And it takes years of experience, this type of craft. You can see there that sloshing off, quite violent discharge of the pulp. This shows you one of the largest screens as well. And they're very heavy, you know, and they've got pulp on them. Probably less heavier than European. You literally lift it up like that with all the water and the pulp till it drains. Whereas you are casting some of it off, the excess. But it's still incredibly heavy. So he's got this pulley system which helps a much swifter action.
Which is beautiful because it's bamboo.
It is, yeah, but it's all lovely. You can see that violent sloshing action. Amazing. So this it encourages, because he's sloshing it off that way, it encourages the fibres with the tuarai root or the neri to align in that direction. So your grain direction will be away from the Papermaker, usually with a chain line. So that denotes how you can tear it, how it expands and it shrinks, and the tensile strength. It doesn't tear so easily across the grain, resists it. Right, couching the sheet again is interesting. When the sheets form, it's transferred obviously onto a flat surface. Now, if you remember last week, they couch one sheet and then a felt, and then another sheet, then a felt. But this is done, that flexible bamboo is lifted off the soot, and using a rolling action, you transfer the pulp onto. It starts off with a wooden board, but then they couch one on top of the other with no interleaving at all. And that's because of the tuarai root, and also because of the internal kind of cohesion with the fibres. And up to 100 or 250 sheets, depends on how big they are, which is more or less the equivalent of a day's work, is laid one on top of the other into a big stack. Sometimes you get thin sheets or strips of silk that are put just between one of the, or each of the freshly couched sheets, but quite often it's just one on top of the other. You can see here them rolling that, very soft pulp. But because of those long fibres, the neri, the hydrogen bonding, the attraction forces of those collapsed down fibres, they've got huge internal strength and they want to be together. They don't really want to stick to that bamboo. And there you can see the pile below of the Japanese paper, just one on top of the other. And that shows you the side. See how thin that sheet is? One on top of the other. So they do that, do a whole stack, and at the end of the day they need to squeeze out the water. This is done for several hours. And then transferred to a press. They increase the pressure for about a 24-hour period. So again, that helps the sheets to bond, or the fibres to bond together. Looks a mess, but you know, that's typical of the kind of press, that's our equivalent. A lot of water is drained out. Less conventional method. So, and then drying and flattening obviously follows. So usually about on the third day, it's removed from the press and each sheet is separated by hand. And they use a hake brush. We use hake brushes a lot, made from goat or sheep hair, very soft, to paste individual sheets onto a drying board. Now the drying boards, unlike the huge amount of pressing that I described last week, is done, you know, fairly simply. So the wooden boards pasted on with the hake brush, and then they're put out in the sun to dry, and under tension the fibres hold to this wooden board. It takes approximately 3 hours to dry. Now the boards are unique objects in themselves, and I'm sure he was telling me porky pies, but one of the paper makers I visited said his boards were over 300 years old. They're used, and they have a quality and a presence in themselves. And they use pulp to fill in gaps as they start splitting. So these are the beautiful handmade. Again, this is a dying art. You know, the hake brushes individually handmade probably take about 2 weeks to make a brush like that. I've seen brush makers in Kyoto. You have to have an introduction. Again, it was a national treasure. And they sit there on tatami mats, cutting these hairs and forming them, sewing them with gut, and bringing them all together. Because this is made from cedar, usually. So as the wood expands, the gut contracts, and vice versa. So they're beautiful brushes. We have similar ones in conservation. So those who will be doing the workshop next week will be using those type of brushes. And then this is lifting the very fine sheet that is still quite damp, using the brush, and then putting it onto a wooden board. And you see the quality of the grain there. It's most treasured, those kind of nuances which form on the back of the paper. Is really an important part of handmade paper making. Also gives a slight sheen to the underside, and that side is normally used by artists and calligraphers, whereas the opposite in Western paper making, we tend to use the top side, the slightly rougher side, and the smoother side. And there the boards in the sun, drying naturally. And then finishing, once the paper is dry, they peel it off, and they put them in stacks usually, and they might cure them or allow them to settle, you know, under slight pressure for, you know, quite a long time. Some very precious papers for years. They'll be put into cooler lofts in order to settle and age nicely. They're also either trimmed to standard mill sizes. You can buy Japanese paper in small sizes to do your own little shoji screens and repair your houses. So they'll have individual sheets, won't they? You can get small sheets. Or most often, and certainly the papers that artists and conservators use, they will have the decal edge intact all the way around. The decal edge, you see, along there, it's usually slightly folded on two edges, and then that looks like it's been trimmed actually. But that's a natural decor. You see that wavy edge. There's a lot of grading and sorting through as well, and you'll sit there under time that's going through, picking off bits, a lot like European papers are. So this is the kind of knife they would use for trimming a whole stack. Again, just a piece of cedar held along there, and it comes down. Very skillful work. You can see it here. Again, these are all handmade tools. Can you imagine cutting that straight through like that? Very hard. And then that's sorting. They'll return, obviously, seconds to repulp, or often they use them to wrap, the good stacks of paper. You can see the weights here. Traditionally, they just have like a big stone to hold them down. Here, a nice, beautiful bar or something. Very relaxing to watch. So that's the process of making the paper. So I just wanted to go through some of the uses of the paper and how it can inform artistic practice. So what do they offer for contemporary artists? They're unique, aren't they? They have their own physical, aesthetic quality, their own presence really, which you can exploit amazingly in your work. They come in a huge range of thicknesses, from wafer thin, as we've seen, to thick board type papers like Hosho. They can be very translucent or opaque. They're incredibly strong and durable, beautiful to work with. They're an absolute dream to work with. And they have this wonderful surface luster which only improves with age. They have wonderful colours, that soft, natural, buff, ivory colours, which are, a result of natural sun bleaching rather than chemicals. And chemically bleached paper looks so artificial when you put them side by side. And we can do that in the workshop, look at those kind of issues. You can get specialised papers that have this oyster shell in them, as I've mentioned before. They're also incredibly absorbent, highly receptive to ink, obviously watercolours and acrylics, and wonderful surfaces to work with both, especially planographic printing processes. They have a very fabric-like quality and a movement which Western style papers certainly don't have. You can crumple them, you can crease them, you can fold them, you can wet them, stretch them, and they're much more forgiving than European papers. And I can show you perhaps in that workshop how to stretch them out so you can work on them for your artwork. But I think probably it's their purity and simplicity, their physical presence, and their obviously reluctance to degrade and discolour with time, which is the most important thing. And we have to think about longevity, even if we are doing quite a lot of experimental work. It's an important thing to think about, But it's not without its disadvantages. The porosity, although can be an advantage for ink drawing, it does make very detailed work. So if you want crisp lines, it can be very, very difficult. It also, if you overwork the surface, particularly the Kozo papers, they can pill or roughen up, so you can get bits of the surface coming off, which is not advisable. And also the expense. You can buy Kozo papers like the Shirakawa here for, £3 probably. It's not a bad quality paper. but you will pay up to 20 or 30 pound a sheet, as I've said, for Gamsey. And Mitsumata are quite rare, just pure Mitsumata papers. So they're not without their disadvantages, but I think their advantages certainly far outweigh the disadvantages. So if you want to distinguish handmade paper, maybe I'll leave this for the next workshop. I think because it's quite difficult to show these sort of things without explanation, really. So I'll leave this till another time. So I don't like to finish on a kind of negative, but the craft of contemporary washi or handmade paper making, although there's still very fine mills and they do get support from the government, is undoubtedly in slow decline, as indeed there are, you know, when you compare the 19th century, the mills that were around in the UK or Europe generally has reduced significantly. So things have changed, priority has changed from quality to profit, and it's an all year round occupation, and the heat in Japan in the summer and the humidity is not conducive for quality papers really, and you get more infestation of mould. The handmade molds or the actual screens, which used to be made by people in each of the mills or just local areas, are now made by 2 or 3 people in Japan. So you get that uniformity of the surface characteristics. Each area, each handmade paper making mill would have their own unique differences in the moulds that they produced. That's gone really. The neri, unfortunately, is stored in preservatives, which lowers its effectiveness. So it doesn't align the fibres so carefully, doesn't coat the papers, the fibres so carefully. Fibres are not or rarely grown now locally. They will import them from big consortiums, largely from the South Seas. You get bass fibres being mixed with poorer grade fibres, like straw, even softwoods. We find, even with conservation papers, we do find softwoods are being used to add in or bulk out the fibres. And now drying is done on heated surfaces, which results in internal stresses forming within the paper. So it increases its propensity to distort when you're adding, especially wet washes or wetting down the paper. And this is the type of thing that they dry the paper on now. A fire is lit under here, and this is red hot, and the papers are separated, stuck on, and within 2 minutes they dry. But that means that the underside that's in close proximity to the metal shrinks slightly more than the outer surface, so you get the tensions and possible curling of the paper. Unfortunately, I've seen it even in quite good quality mills. They're starting to use chemical bleaches and acid dyes. Non-traditional fillers are added to affect the quality of the paper, and it certainly affects the stability and longevity as well. We also get this kind of European or hybrid production, which, as I say, I don't know really how they're made, with synthetics added into them, dispersions, which we don't know their long-term effects. No research that I know has gone on to look at their effects. And it's a bit worrying really, because they do look quite similar to reasonable quality handmade paper. Often they have now watermarks, because Japanese paper never has watermarks or countermarks, ever. But you do get on these machine-made ones, often along the outer on the outer edges, usually logos and inscriptions, but never on handmade paper. So that's a sign of handmade as well, no watermark. So in conclusion, I'm sorry it takes so long, for over 1500 years now, Japan's been producing handmade paper of various quality and variety, and I think it's the best paper in the world. That rapid changes are occurring which threatens the purity. But hopefully with the Japanese government they will increase their support and awareness and make more national treasures to keep this iconic and ancient craft alive. So long may it continue. So had a little bit of help with that from one of my ex-students, Narumi, Mr. Mura, who's now at the British Museum, and one or two of the photographs were given to me by the head of the National Library of Norway, Nina, who's also a friend. Thank you to them.